the Western Test Range in California, July 23rd, 1972. The satellite's orbit, near polar and circular, takes 103 minutes. Due to the Earth's rotation, each new orbit is displaced about 1,500 miles to the west at the equator. The spacecraft makes 3 passes over North America daily, 14 around the globe.
Reimagine, respond, restore. At the School of Environmental Sustainability, we are called to create solutions. Our mission caters to the needs of our planet, using teaching and research to benefit humanity. Together, we will build the world for the common good of generations to come. Rise up and take action. Your calling starts today.
Welcome everyone to day 2 of our annual climate change conference. It's lovely to see so many participants here. Tonight we're featuring a panel entitled Art as a Platform for Climate Advocacy. My name is Nancy Tuckman and I'm the founding dean of the School of Environmental Sustainability here at Loyola University, Chicago. And tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce Thomas Alayan. He is a local singer and artist and coordinator of the Energy Initiative at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Mr. Alayan is going to be serving as tonight's panel moderator, and he's friends with many of the people that are on the panel. They're all in the local artist community. And I'd just like to say how excited I am to see 3 young faculty from Loyola Chicago, 2 of them in the Department of Fine and Performing Arts and the other in the School of Communication, sharing their art with us and how they use art as a way to advocate for climate change. So I would now like to turn it over to Mr. Alayan and have you introduce your panelists. Thomas?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean Tuckman, and thank you so much for including this panel on the arts as part of the Climate Change Conference. And for our friends that are out there, the Dean willed this panel into being back in 2019. And I've known Nancy because of my work at UIC, and I've been friends with Kirsten for a very long time, one of our panelists. And when Kirsten and I realized we were both on parallel trajectories, we're both heading off to get our doctorates, and we're both interested in the interconnections between environmentalism and music, I immediately contacted Nancy about that connection, and I think basically within about 2 weeks, this whole team had formed. Unfortunately, like most things in 2020, the conference was canceled, but we all vowed to get the band back together, and here we are, so we have done so, and thanks again to the Dean. Thanks so much to Zach Wakeman, to Rachel, and to everyone who has made this panel possible. So tonight, we are going to enjoy a few performances and have some great discussions with 3 Renaissance polymaths, teachers, artists, and as we can see through their work tonight and through those discussions, environmentalists. And I'm so proud to have them as colleagues and to highlight through this discussion their work and the work of their students at Loyola who are hopefully out there watching this right now. Please join me in welcoming Loyola faculty. First of all, Director of Choral Activities, Kirsten Hedgard. Then founding director of dance, Sandra Kaufman. And finally, Meredith Like from the School of Communications. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight on this panel. And so perhaps in that order, so Kirsten, Sandra, and Meredith, would you please take a couple minutes to say hello to our audience, introduce yourselves and your affiliation with Loyola, your background and interests, and maybe how you found yourself in this environmental/art space. That would be really interesting to hear.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Dean Tuckman, for inviting me and my colleagues to serve on this panel. In fact, I would consider my involvement here today as a testament to the power of art as climate advocacy. As the director of choral and vocal activities at Loyola, I have been, over the years, profoundly influenced by my collaborations with the dance division and Sandra Kaufman in relation to our work with the School of Environmental Sustainability. From our early collaborations, which I think were initiated 6 to 7 years ago, to our more recent work, including today's panel, my teaching, professional research, and my personal relationship with sustainability have been significantly impacted through this specific and important interdisciplinary work. As a matter of fact, I'm excited to say that just last week, I submitted my dissertation at the University of Illinois, which is a study of recent environmental choral works. I look forward to telling you a bit more about my recent projects at Loyola, but I'd also like to share some general information about the ways that I've been exploring the integration of music and environmentalism. As a singer and conductor, so primarily interested in vocal and choral music, my relationship to this topic is focused on that repertoire, especially the work of composers John Luther Adams and R. Murray Schafer, both of whom have been pioneers in this genre. Additionally, there are a growing number of composers who have written works to address environmental concerns, both indirectly through pieces that you might say evoke sonic landscapes and perhaps encourage deep ecological listening, as John Luther Adams likes to put it, as well as more directly, and in some cases even politically, through carefully crafted texts that might highlight subjects like climate comfort or climate crisis, endangered species, and other environmental concerns. Recent works that I've studied have included John Luther Adams' Canticles of the Holy Wind, a 14-movement work that explores the sonic aspects of the wind, sky, and birds. And likewise, R. Murray Schafer's environmental choral works also deal with the aural realization of natural landscapes, as well as ways that we might become better stewards of the earth. Another work that recently has caught my attention is Sarah Kirkland Snyder's Mass for the Endangered for chorus, soloist, and small orchestra. And this work takes a different tack. And I'd like to share just a really brief quote by her on this work because I think it encapsulates the work that many people in this field are striving to do. And so I quote Kirkland, "The origin of the Mass is rooted in humanity's concern for itself, expressed through worship of the divine, which in the Catholic tradition is a God in the image of man. I thought it would be interesting to take the Mass's musical modes of spiritual contemplation and apply them to concern for non-human life, animals, plants, and the environment. There is an appeal to a higher power for mercy, forgiveness, and intervention, but that appeal is directed not to God, but rather to nature itself." And I love this quote because I think it relates to how I feel about my work in this field, taking the musical modes of contemplation and applying them to concern for non-human life. Of course, the concern is truly for all human and non-human life working towards an ecological balance. And I hope that some of our work presented here tonight will encourage others to explore this exciting interdisciplinary work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandra.
My name is Sandra Kaufman. I am the founding director of the dance program at Loyola University Chicago, and I have been for many, many years just a real lover of science. To me, science and art, there really isn't a dichotomy there. They're both trying to really seek a fundamental truth. And, to go back to sort of quoting what Kirsten was saying is, I would study something so beautiful, photosynthesis, right? Or even then the balance of photosynthesis and aerobic respiration and how the cycle of life is so minutely and so perfectly constructed. And so nature seems so perfect. We can predict a solar eclipse 500 years from now. And yet I really don't understand why people are so thoughtless or cruel or selfish to each other that they would willingly either exploit this planet, work in a place where they're not working with nature or caring for nature or caring for other selves. And so it was always a mystery to me. I was like, I sought comfort in science and in the poetry of science. And so, they say that all new discoveries come from either the imagination of the scientist or the precision of the artist. And I really, again, say that there's not a duplicity between science and art. Another quote would be, what's the difference between a physics lab and a cathedral? Aren't they both just trying to say hello, So this idea of finding solace and inspiration in a chaotic and confusing world through the beauty and the poetry of nature and the natural world. And so as an artist, a performing artist and a choreographer, for me, when I'm struck with inspiration, I can't even explain why, but I simply have to make work about it. So I began constructing. I've made many, many works in my early career in New York, inspired by natural science. And then had a very significant event when I went to listen to Dr. Brian Greene, who's a theoretical physicist, speak at the Natural History Museum on superstring theory, and which is a model in theoretical physics. And we can understand that kind of a quantum theory, atomic theory, molecules and things. We understand Brownian motion, so it's all moving, right? Superstring postulates that it's a very specific way that things are moving, that give the characteristics to all things that we know, including our own consciousness. And so for me, I did a really deep dive into superstring theory. Partnered up with Dr. Greene. We were given, with playwright Michael Bassett and composer Patrick Doherty, a commission to create a full evening interdisciplinary work on superstring theory, which we did. And then that wound up, we were featured a little bit on a NOVA special or in the World Science Festival, and ultimately gave a keynote address at Art Science International. And so that was something that was just a really huge and really exciting creative outlet for me. And then around about that time, I was finishing up my professional performing career with the Martha Graham Dance Company, and I served as their representative for a large-scale public education initiative called the Empire State Partnership, which was revolutionary and a large funding sponsored by the New York State Foundation for the Arts and New York State Commission for the Arts to use the arts to teach core curriculum. And so this was something that fascinated me. I developed a lot of curriculum, and we saw some remarkable success in teaching various different kinds of core curriculum science topics, as well as social science topics, but I'll focus on the physical sciences for today. And I found this very exciting, revolutionary way to approach science and science education. And since the emphasis of this year's program is on engaging the youth, it felt important to talk about some of these science education initiatives. So my discussion later on will be featuring that. And then my final statement would just be that working here at Loyola University Chicago with leadership like Nancy and her cohort at the School of Environmental Sustainability, it's been so meaningful for me. And I think Kirsten, I see her nodding too, that we can be artists that can, work in tandem in an interdisciplinary manner in a cause that we all care so deeply about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Meredith.
Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you to everyone who organized this and my co-panelists. I'm excited to hear more from everyone. So my name is Meredith Like. I teach at the School of Communication. I teach animation and design here at Loyola University Chicago. And I thought by way of introduction, I'd actually sort of reach back and think about some of the early forces that shaped my interest in climate change. I think we're all moved by this vast topic in different ways. And I was thinking back to what really sort of stoked what's been almost a lifelong interest in and concern about climate change. And I think part of it, I have to credit my parents for dragging me and my brother on walks outside of Boston, incredibly dull seeming as a child. I was like, oh, we're going for a walk. Great. Can't we do something more fun? But that really gave me a deep sort of innate appreciation for the complexity of living things and ecosystems. My mother in particular would point out different plant names and sort of explained how different animals were reliant on each other for survival, and whole plant ecosystems existed, like when you see a log that's fallen in the forest, all of the life that grows up from this dead log. And I think it really gave me a sense of the beauty and the richness, but also the interreliance of things on each other, and how when that's disrupted, things can go out of balance. And I think the sort of other strand, the more human strand of my interest, I would say, I'm going to get a little psychoanalytic here, but I would think it stems from my family's sort of diverse involvement in World War II. I have a grandfather who fought in World War II. I had distant German relatives who fought on the other side. And then I had another line of my family that was basically exterminated in Poland. And so the kind of, this legacy of conflict, I think, has made me attuned to not wanting it, and to thinking about conditions that create conflict, and how we can live in a more peaceful world. And I can't think of a greater disruptor than climate change, and especially given that it will most likely affect those in the global south more, and within the US, it's well known to affect Black and Brown communities more. I feel a real sort of strong humanitarian desire to work with climate change and to try to speak about it in my own artistic way. So I will leave that to the rest of it, but thank you very much.
Excellent. And I have already thought of a few questions for different people here tonight. If you are watching at home and you have any questions or any thoughts, please throw them in the Q&A box and we'll start sorting through them immediately. But thanks again so much for that background, all three of you. I was kind of hoping that there might be a cat Zoom bomb that happened, but that didn't. So that's okay. Maybe it'll happen later if y'all have cats. So anyway, moving on now to our presentation and discussion. I want to offer a couple thoughts on our panel tonight, which will help us frame maybe the discussion going forward. So as the Dean mentioned earlier, I work at UIC, and in my 11 years running UIC Summer Institute on Sustainability and Energy, students have regularly asked me how I combine my work as a musician with my work as a sustainability educator. And despite being around environmentalists and sustainability-minded scientists and engineers for over a decade, it wasn't actually until a couple years ago that I became actively interested in exploring how I could do this. And using my doctoral work at UW-Madison, I've constructed 3 such music courses that kind of explored these connections between music, but also the natural sciences, humanities, social sciences, and of course, environmentalism. And I was fortunate to get to teach one of those courses through UIC's Honors College last fall. The class, called Music as a Tool for Environmentalism and Change, is kind of a rather assuming and declarative phrase. And over the course of the semester, alongside 25 thoughtful undergraduates, we turned that around onto its head, and we really changed it to a question: is music a tool for environmentalism and change? And we challenged some of our definitions. We asked, what do we mean by music? What do we mean by change? We learned about the development of environmental movements in the United States that were inclusive of those from who have been ecologically othered. For instance, like our Indigenous and African American communities. We surveyed scientific research in biology, chemistry, psychology to consider how music affects individuals. And finally, we considered studies that accounted for the use of music in environmental and socio-political movements. I'm happy to say that I emerged from teaching that class understanding that yes, music and the arts are indeed one important and pervasive tool in environmental movements. There is, to my knowledge, no successful social movement that has not involved the arts. And so let's start with the premise with our conversation that art is an essential tool in environmentalism and sustainability. The question we turn to this evening is one of how. And to that end, as a panel, we want to consider, how do we engage environmentalism through art? Our panelists, as you now have seen, as we will explore further, each have an experience in these areas as artists, as researchers, and as teachers. So as a group, we're also particularly interested in how this affects students and our work in the classroom. Each panelist will present about 5 minutes of their work, after which we will open the floor for about 15 minutes of discussion, questions amongst panelists, and at that point, we'll definitely start inserting questions from our Q&A, and I already see people coming in, which is great. And with that, I'd love to invite Kirsten to join us on stage. I guess she's already here. As our first panelist, Kirsten, the floor is yours, and we can't wait.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And as I think I mentioned earlier, I would really love to see some of the findings from that class. What I've discovered in my more recent research, finishing up this dissertation, is it's such a new area for scholarship that there are just many directions to research and building a repertoire for others to reference. It's really an exciting time, I think, for arts and climate advocacy. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I've been engaged in this work for a number of years at Loyola. And over the last few years, it's become a much more serious focus for me. Now I feel perhaps there won't be enough time for me to perform all of these amazing works that I think have something to say in this area. So recently I've been engaged with several projects, both of which rely on student participation. Of course, we all know this is a difficult time for teaching over Zoom online, and you might be wondering, how do you lead a choral rehearsal over Zoom? That's a different discussion. But nonetheless, over the last year, we've been able to create a number of really meaningful projects, and having the additional subject matter of asking the question, how can art, how can music support um, the area of climate change, environmental studies, and really what is our role as musicians in this area. Two of the projects I'm working on somewhat accidentally have come to fruition this week, the week of the climate conference, but I think it's been a happy coincidence. One project that's in process right now is a 7-day countdown to spring. So each day we are releasing a virtual choir video that contemplates the beauty of nature. And that will culminate on Saturday, the first day of spring, with our largest video, which is a recording of Frank Kelly's Earth Song that includes singers from 2 Loyola choirs, as well as the 3 campuses at the University of Illinois, Springfield, Chicago, Champaign-Urbana. And so the students recorded their parts in their homes and then have been edited into one final video. And this particular video is also a part of a larger program I've been working on. And that link, I believe, will be made available to all conference participants later in the week when the final editing is done. And this larger project is called Elements and explores 4 of the elements in the classical sense of earth, fire, air, and water, with water being sort of the overriding force in this particular production. As I just was checking my notes here, and the way I've described it in the sort of the general banner for this project is it's a sound exploration of the 4 states of matter in the form of earth, fire, air, and water, ruminating on the early philosophy that all is water. Elements is also a meditation on water's singular importance and relationship to the other 3 elements. It's a 35-minute program, and there are also professional ensemble members from a new group I just recently formed called the New Earth Ensemble to explore this repertoire. But the students play a significant role in several pieces, including Earth Song, but also in a recording of Katerina Gamon's Fire, which hourly represents the sound of a crackling fire. However, the piece that I'd like to share with you may be one of the pieces on the program that I'm most proud of, just given the current circumstances. And it's a piece entitled 5 Miniature Windscapes. This piece came about after I had to reject our first choice for the air concept, which was going to be a virtual recording of John Luther Adams' Canticles of the Holy Wind, the first movement of that longer work. But it soon became clear to me that work was far too hard to manage under virtual circumstances. So what I did with the students is we studied John Luther Adams' work, and we also studied R. Murray Schafer's Once on a Windy Night, both sonic landscapes interpreting wind. And after a week of studying those, I divided the students into 5 groups of 4 singers each and said, I'd like for you to create your own windscape, play around with sounds, with vocalizing, and create your own windscape, give it a title, and we'll put them together in a 5-movement work which is now known as 5 Miniature Windscapes. And tonight is the premiere of several of those works. We only have time to watch 2 or 3, and I think they're queued up now. So now you have heard the premiere of 5 Miniature Windscapes, and it's just so fun to see what the students came up with during their time together. And I just wanted to point out one more thing, and that is this this lineage in American composition that goes back to even Charles Ives, but really finds meaning in the work of John Cage, and then eventually Pauline Oliveros, and then John Luther Adams. And so this sort of exploration, aleatoric, sort of, I guess we could still say avant-garde, is sort of continues on in some of this work that I've been studying.
Interesting. So I have a question right off the bat, and my question is, you know, when you worked with students on this, like, what was sort of the reaction to doing sort of like non-traditional sorts of sounds as a choir, as an ensemble?
Oh boy, I really hope that some of them are listening right now. You know, it's always also hard to read students over Zoom because of course they worked on this remotely and they worked in a program where they could collaborate on sounds. Um, and I still think even though, you know, John Cage, you know, was passed away 25 years ago, his music and the concepts of his music still seem avant-garde. And also some of the sort of freedom that comes along with letting go of preconceived notions of how music should sound, what it should be, what music can do. I'd like to believe that I created a convincing argument as I shared examples with them. And as a matter of fact, I didn't really have time to say this in my introduction to the piece, but we actually used a textbook by R. Murray Schafer called, oh gosh, Creative Music. But he had educational philosophies, and we used his text and did a bunch of exercises to help prepare them for opening their imagination. And in a way, I think sometimes we have to think of our imagination as it was when we were children. And yeah, I thought it was such a fun project and such a good project for using the imagination at creative education. That's the name of the book, R. Murray Schafer.
Excellent. And Sandra and Meredith, feel free to jump in at any time you want to. And I'm watching our Q&A. There's some great questions that are out there. I have another one just because I'm in charge, because I really want to ask this one too. Is like, we know, music can quote unquote move people for whatever that means. Like, we know that there's like a physical reaction when we hear certain sonic sounds for various reasons, right? When you were in person, and hopefully we'll be back to person this coming fall, hopefully, when you're in person and you're working with students in this choral atmosphere and you're working with them on this kind of this music, right? What have been some sort of like the emotionally vulnerable things that students have come to you and expressed through this music, and what have been some of the things that it has taught them? Because I think we're all interested, right, in how students react to this.
Hmm. It's a really good question, and I've given it a lot of thought in relation to this work, but also other important topics we cover in choral singing. And I think it's maybe two, possibly threefold. One is are the discussions that come along with addressing these topics. Sometimes I think about the saying, you are what you eat and you are what you sing. And if you're singing music that essentially, puts you face to face with some important concepts, and then you couple that with beauty, the beauty that's being produced by sound, it can be immensely powerful, moving, and it stays with people. So that's from the performing side, and also the educational side of what we can do in the classroom when we're working on this music. But then, of course, as performers, hopefully we'll be back to performing someday again, when you can share this music and frame it in a way that creates some educational bit about it, I think there's a real opportunity to move the audience to take away something, because music can be a physically powerful experience, and sometimes we take that with us longer than we might, reading a book about the same important topic. And I've had students, after graduation, come back to me and remind me of some of these projects we've worked on. And so it's inspiring in a myriad of ways. And I could go on about that, but there are other questions. I think it's a great topic to consider.
And on that note, have any of the students who have come back to you, have they told you that this work, this experience of the intersection of music and environmentalism, how did that impact either their career trajectory or maybe what they were doing kind of in volunteering or joining certain movements? What were some of the things that it caused them to do?
Well, I think on the larger level, of course, we're working in this specific area, and we're hoping that very much in relation to environmental choices, people are moved in that specific way. But I would say beyond that, what it really has done, time and time again, is show students that within the arts, we can affect change. as educators, as performers, the more that we are bringing this into the world, the more people will be affected by it. And so, in addition to just being more thoughtful humans on the earth, the broader scope is that these young people take these ideas of advocacy and make it their own in their own disciplines. Um, and yeah, it's a pretty miraculous process.
Um, and I know we're going to have to move on here in a minute, but one of the interesting things in the chat is some people have asked some very generalized questions that could be applied to all the panelists, and I want to sprinkle those throughout. But I want to start with you, Kirsten. Martina says in chat, she says, as a young artist and a woman involved in STEM career, I find it hard to look for my vocation. What motivated you, and then Sandra and Meredith, you want to weigh in a minute too, what motivated you to become an activist through your artistic career, and how can we follow the same steps? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, lots of thoughts on that. I feel, for myself, there is an urgency and so much to be done. And I'm a musician. It's just this is the way that I am, and I have been troubled by the many tasks we're called upon to take care of in our lives, and how that has pulled me away sometimes from being a more thoughtful participant in relation to the earth. And this really has troubled me. And so eventually, over a period of time, carving out this piece of my work has meant so much to me, because the integration of what I do as a musician, coupled with something I think is of the absolute, importance and urgency, has allowed me to live with myself and be happier with who I am and what I can do as just a person walking around in my discipline, which of course maybe might 20 years ago have seemed like an impossible thing to do. How would you possibly bring these two disparate things together? And so I think it's a bit of a matter of defining your priorities and then finding creative ways of bringing them together, and always in pursuit of that integration.
Fantastic. Sandra, Meredith, you both have been very quiet. Do you have any thoughts on what Kirsten said or anything to add?
Well, I would add one thing is that Kirsten and I were very devoted to the creation of a program called Missa Gaia, but it was created in response to Laudato Si, which was Pope Francis, his encyclical on the on climate change, on the environment, and on care for the earth. And he challenges all of us to do something, young, old, weak, strong. It doesn't matter what you do or even how much you do, but that you are called to act. He again, to echo Kirsten's sentiment, there's an urgency to it. And to us as artists, and to address, I forget the name of the panel, the audience member who asked that, I feel like you're a STEM scientist. Pope Francis would say, how can you give back, right? She mentioned, I thought it was a female, was that, they're an artist and in STEM. And I would just say that, in the way that Kirsten has, is to maybe find a way that your work comes together. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to, it just, again, it's almost your own personal transformation or the transformation of how you work in the classroom. But he urged us all to act and act in any way that we can, however humble.
All right. Meredith, do you have anything to add? If not, that's totally fine.
I'll just say that I really appreciate how the role of expression functions in that work. I mean, thinking from the visual arts perspective, it's expressive, but in a different time frame, in the way that making music and singing and bringing those things together, there's a different power for activating a kind of communal energy. And I just really appreciated that from that project.
Perfect. And we will move on to Sandra here momentarily, but Kirsten, you should get a shout out because we did have a note from your student Claudia, who says, it has been amazing to have the opportunity to cover so many amazing topics in your class. Super excited to hear how Earth Song comes out as well. So number one, appreciate it. Number two, yeah, your student showed up. So bravo.
Great. Claudia, make sure you share that with all of your classmates tomorrow.
TikTok. All right, great. Sandra, let's hear from you now. We can't wait to hear more about your work.
Yes, well, I'm so inspired by Kirsten. I kind of need to like soak it in a little bit. My topic actually for today is not centered on performance, although I care very much about performance and have done a lot of, very inspired performances on the topic of science and nature. But I want to talk today about engaging young people through education. And so essentially, if I was going to give a topic to my discussion, it would be climate change advocacy explored through dance and the lens of Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. So Benjamin Bloom is an educational theorist who created a hierarchical system for for knowledge acquisition, and they put this hierarchical system of knowledge into three broad domains. The cognitive, which is the knowledge domain of which most school programs, including higher education, are built for. The affective domain, which is your values and your emotions and your motivations, and then psychomotor domain. So I think if we're talking about dance, the psychomotor domain may be self-evident, although I would postulate that the first way that we gather information about being a living being is through our body. And even when we think we're not taking in immense amounts of cues through our kinesthetic awareness, we really, really are. So I would postulate already at the foundation that movement is a fundamental language, although I have to say that I wouldn't contradict what Kirsten and Meredith are bringing it as well, because I believe that their languages are also fundamental languages. So these languages of art, but I'm talking from the realm of dance. So dance unifies these three domains. Psychomotor, of course, self-evident. Affective, your values, your feelings. The affective domain is what is ever going to make somebody change their behavior. And the affective domain, the base level, as I mentioned, their hierarchical, is just paying attention, right? So using the physical domain to create attention, these domains of knowledge begin to work together. And ultimately, what I'm arguing, at least today, is that the cognitive domain, which we all are relatively familiar with, or at least we think we are, I think could be revolutionized by including movement education. So there are some pretty heavy hitters who would agree with me on this. One being Dewey, learning by doing, educational theorist. I forget Dewey's first name. Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System, learning by doing. And since I believe many of us here are AJCU faculty, understanding that in Ignatian pedagogy, your personal experience is highly valued. The experiential nature of living and values formation is essential for reflection and knowledge, and ultimately leading to evaluation and further actions. So the idea of engaging in the world physically, leading to reflection and action is very Ignatian, and I'm happy to talk any more about that as well. And then the third, I think that resonates probably mostly with many of us. I believe that most of us are familiar with the concept of multiple intelligences, but I will unpack it just slightly here. This is most probably familiar by the work of Howard Gardner, a Harvard psychologist, but its implication in education and educational theory has been absolutely immense. And the idea is that we are not just, sitting still. Visual learners, people who have good visual learning skills are able to learn information by taking it in visually. People who have good oral learning skills, they can hear information and they can visualize from that. Some people have musical learning skills. Some people have spatial skills. They have incredible spatial awareness. So they've outlined 7 different intelligences, or 8 actually, including interpersonal and intrapersonal, as well as musical intelligence, visual intelligence, and kinesthetic intelligence, right? So this idea of multiple intelligences is resonating very, very, very deeply within the educational community, and is the heart and soul of what I'm offering to you today, which is that if you address, there's this quote, and people attribute it to Einstein, I'm not exactly sure, but it's like, if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, the fish is a failure. But you never ask the fish if it could swim, and boy, oh boy, it's going to be better than the monkey at swimming, right? So this idea of coming together as a community, seeing young people as assets who may not have the same passive audio and visual skills of taking in passive information like we expect all college students and high school students and even elementary school students to just sit there and take knowledge in without a dynamic interpersonal exchange. So the way that education system is really built right now is for people to passively audio-visually process knowledge. And through the arts, through dance, through engaged learning, we really want to affect not only cognitive learning, but affective learning. And through the use of the psychomotor domain, it kind of pulls it all together. And I think my video will show that in an example. So what I want to say is, you as climate scientists, that science is all movement. Are we talking about, let's say, non-living things? Are we talking about erosion? Are we talking about plate tectonics? Are we talking about convection? Are we talking about gravity? We're talking about living things. Think about RNA and DNA transfer and how it's all like a little choreography, or meiosis or mitosis. How a plant grows from a seed in the earth and takes in all of the soil, works again with our carbon dioxide and creates food that we need and oxygen. This is all done in these systematic processes that unfold over time, very much like choreography, and can be addressed and taught and processed through a physical mode. So the idea is, if you address some of these concepts, like I'll give you an example. Well, actually, we have an example to see, so I don't need to explain it with words. I'll show you an example in a moment. But what I want to say before I show you a little example of how this could work with education is that dance is, again, it's a holistic activity. It's engaging all of these domains of learning with the idea of activating people's value system and increasing change. So if we're looking for climate advocacy and activism, we need to work in the affective domain, right? So if you teach people things about climate change and you do it in a way that they feel engaged and enlightened by, they're going to care more about it. And again, we're trying to unlock this untapped potential of today's youth as climate activists. And I would just say, let's think about them not as all thinking and learning and acting and behaving in the same way, but actually as individual beings with their own strengths that we can come together and play, very much like the harmonics of Kirsten's choir singing together. So what we find is, when you teach a subject matter like, carbon transfer or I'll use plate tectonics because I'll talk about it in a minute, that students are able to remember. They're able to remember the sequence. They are able then to describe what they did, because they did it with their bodies. And then they are able to use that ability to transfer domains. So example, a student who can't really understand plate tectonics, they learn about subduction, abduction, and then they are able to identify it. They see it in action. They can describe what they did, and then they're able to invest in that written and writing domain, which is so prevalent in our society. And then it also creates enjoyment, values, and community. So these kind of activities can really promote climate advocacy, not only for young people, but it also enhances science learning all the way across the curriculum. And many of you have even probably heard of the new idea of dance your DNA, or dance your PhD. And this is something that, if we wanted to talk about maybe in the questions later, we can bring in some of this kinesthetic education and the idea that it refers to in science education in particular. So what we're doing is, when we can engage young people in multiple domains, you may be able to pick up some of those who have forgotten. So I just want to end talking a little bit about the affective domain and working within different multiple modes of intelligence. I'll tell you a story that took place during that Empire State Partnership. Let me just check my chat. I might be going too long. Nailing it? No, I'm right on time. Okay, great. One final story and then a little clip would be, so we were taking part in the Empire State Partnership, and my colleague was teaching a geology unit. We were doing hotspot hulas and island formation, and we were doing plate tectonics. And she created like a movement phrase based on plate tectonics. And she was having the students all line up, and they were subducting underneath each other, and the kids were like, I don't get it. The kids were having a hard time connecting to what the teacher was asking them to do. And one student was like, oh, I see it. Oh, I get it. I totally get it. It was like an epiphany for her. And she started bossing everybody around. They all managed to do it. They had a great unit. And this student wound up really shining with her gifts. And what we found out after that unit is the teacher was just sitting there beaming, because this is a student who had been on academic probation and had been acting out. Was not getting the concepts, was starting to be very disruptive, and was really tuning out from the community. And so here was an environment where just happened to be there, just happened to be in her school doing a lesson where her great ability to visualize scientific information became apparent. And after that, that student had a very different trajectory in their 6th grade year. So I think that's what I would leave my remarks at for now. And what we're going to show is a short video clip of a project that we did here with our students at Loyola, with our dance pedagogy students who worked with a local 5th grade class at Pierce Elementary School. The ultimate project was actually very much based on climate change, but I wanted a short excerpt to show you. So we're going to show you 2 other short dance pieces that they did, and then we can come back and talk about it. So Zach, if we could have the Pierce project.
Process called transesterification. One dancer represents the fat, which is typically vegetable oil, and the other dancer represents the alcohol, most often ethanol or methanol. A catalyst is also added to speed up the reaction. Through the process of the reaction, the catalyst is used entirely as to not affect the end products. After the process of transesterification is complete, the 2 products remaining are glycerol and biodiesel.
Nuclear fusion is the process that fuels our sun and gives off energy. Nuclear fusion is a reaction where 2 atomic nuclei fuse together to create a larger nucleus, and in the process release energy. This energy releases a photon, and the photon emits the light and warmth the sun gives the earth.
In the first part of photosynthesis, solar radiation splits a molecule of water inside of the plant, causing the release of an electron. This electron then flows through 3 different complexes in chloroplast, during which pieces of water molecules, hydrogen atoms, are also pumped through the complexes. The pumping of hydrogens allows for a build of energy. When this energy is released, 2 high-energy molecules, NADPH and ATP, are created.
In the second part of photosynthesis, the dark reactions, carbon atoms are shuffled around to create a 6-carbon sugar, glucose. The carbon atoms from a carbon dioxide molecule is added to a 5-carbon molecule already present inside of the plant cell. This molecule then goes through 2 transformations into 2 different 3-carbon chains. One of these chains goes on to form a glucose molecule, while the other is remade into the 5-carbon starting chain, which goes on to repeat the process.
Okay, so thank you. Those are just kind of examples of how we can use, and again, this is non-performance dance material. This is just kind of great fun activities that we're doing in class that really tie it right back into scientific learning for our students.
Fantastic. So Sandra, we're getting close to time, but I want to throw a question out, and then I want to throw a question out from our Q&A. And it struck me when you were doing an introduction, first of all, your passion just seeps through the Zoom screen, which I love. One of the things that you had mentioned earlier is you brought up the idea that science and art are seeking fundamental truth. And you also mentioned, I think earlier in this one is you separated man from nature in terms of how you were talking about them. And I feel that, at least in my class, like we talk about that too, like how are we not a part of nature and things like that. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about in some cultures, right, like dance and music are inseparable. in some cultures, poetry and music are inseparable. And to you, the way that you're talking, it's like science and the arts are inseparable. So I'm wondering if you could maybe spiel on that for a moment and tell me what you think about that.
Well, I really believe it. I mean, I think I'd mentioned that I just love science, and I find it comforting for me, and very, very beautiful and very inspiring. And I will say for me, it all comes down to dancing. Are we talking about cloud formations? Are we talking about convection currents? That's choreography to me. Are we talking about, you know, how soil erosion will eventually over time build up new sedimentary material into a rock? And that's a dance to me too. Like all of these kind of concepts, especially living things, again, but non-living things are also, it all comes down to movement. I mean, Dewey postulates that the whole universe is movement. So, and it can be subatomic particles, it can be elements, it can be molecules as well. They're all moving either through Brownian motion or through, like we had said, the superstrings.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, I want to throw a question from the Q&A first to you, Sandra, and then Kirsten and Meredith, if you guys want to weigh in as well. I'm going to rephrase this question because I think it's a great question, but the person framed it in a specific instance. And these projects that we're working on, that you are working on, Misa Gaia, the dance projects, Meredith, when we come to some of the photography and the animation that you're doing, these are kind of in some sense, right, culturally specific. They're occurring either in Western culture or they're occurring with sort of our specific academic training. How can these be, the person specifically cited Africa. So how can these projects help people in Africa see the need to preserve their environment? So I'm kind of curious, like, how is it that we can take our artwork out and express it to people in different places that maybe have not been exposed to Misa Gaia or some of the specific artwork that we're doing here?
Well, I would argue that many communities have a very rich dance tradition in Africa and music tradition, and very, very rich. We've done some work with social sciences, how the environment shapes dances, and we compared hula movement, music, and costumes, and what the ceremonies consist of with the Scottish Highland dance, and how very, very different people move and what they wear and their values, doing Scottish Highland dancing versus hula, which is very chthonic, very into the earth, done barefoot, softness, the waves of nature. And so for me, if I was going to go into another environment, you look at things sort of like what is the prime food source? What is the prime economic? What is their prime spiritual? And try to find those commonalities and flush them out through some sort of creative process to get them to value it. Because I didn't get a chance to mention it, but ultimately creating something about it is the most high value.
Kirsten, Meredith, any thoughts?
I was going to, I didn't have a chance to talk about this in the other times I was speaking, but, there is this emerging discipline of ecomusicology, which some believe is still a subset of ethnomusicology. And so that is one area of research where quite a bit has been done, lots of really rich articles. And just through the specific work I've been doing, I've already been imagining the ways that the very specific work I do, which is with choirs and singers in this small area of expertise I have, that I'm trained to do. But, because this is such an interdisciplinary field, thinking of ways to be able to have interdisciplinary work with other ecomusicologists and work that they're doing in South America and in Africa and other remote regions. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We're actually doing a project in choir following our current project, which is exploring singing traditions around the world. And I think something like that could very easily, through a research project, through some sort of travel, interact with other culture in a very exciting way.
Yes. Meredith, any thoughts on that one?
I mean, I can address that question a little bit maybe when I talk about my own work, but I did have one quick question for Sandra. I'm so curious in working with these young people, to what degree are you explaining the concepts, and you know, when is it sort of, when do they take over in this kind of embodied learning as they're sort of bringing the science into their motions?
Oh, it definitely starts with the science. It starts with, they were fifth graders, so it was fifth grade competency level of the science. But first they're taught the science, and then we just work with them to facilitate the movement for what they come down with. So the students created all the movement. Now we helped them practice it, and we shaped it, but really we were like, what could be a gesture that, what does an electron seem like? Well, we never know where an electron's going to go or whatever. So I don't know. The kid decided that it was going to stick out its tongue at you to be kind of crazy, right? Because you don't know where the electron is in space. So definitely starting with the science and let the kids interpret it, maybe with some facilitation physically to the best that they can.
Wonderful. Sandra, I don't know if you can see the Q&A chat, but you have two at the bottom by Felipe and David that I don't want to overlook because I think they're interesting questions.
Okay.
If you're able to respond to those, that'd be great. But I also want to I want to make sure that we get Meredith in for her full time. So hopefully you can do that. But thank you so much, Sandra. Appreciate that. Meredith, let's hear from you and get to see some of your great work.
All right. So I want to just walk you through, hopefully quickly, two projects that I worked on with scientists, and I sort of wanted to focus on what it has been like for me as an artist to be in conversation, making work that sort of from the ground up is in conversation with science. And I'm hoping maybe in some way it will speak to the question earlier about how to sort of do art and STEM at the same time, because it's something that I'm also interested in. So I came to Chicago 7 years ago for graduate school. And as I said in my opening, you know, I've had this long-term interest in climate change, but for a long time it was kind of vague, like more of this general emotion-based response rather than having a lot of specific knowledge. And so in the upper left corner here, you can see I was trying to animate icebergs, and they're these kind of like plastic blobby looking things. And I felt like it was a real visual representation of how ill-formed my knowledge was. I was like, this doesn't really look like an iceberg. But there are people out there who know these things. And so I was fortunate to take advantage of a grant out of the University of Chicago that pairs, or it funds pairings of artists and scientists in collaboration to make a new work that sort of grows out of the dialogue between the artists and scientists. And so I found my way to a glaciologist, a glacier scientist named Andrew Malone, who was in the final year of his PhD and somehow decided to take on an artistic project as well. And I approached him with this kind of ill-formed idea that I wanted to somehow compare glaciers to Chicago to get some sense of the scale of how big a glacier is, because I'm making plastic blobby icebergs. I don't know how big a glacier is, what's going on. And so he sort of brought me into his research, which is on a ice cap in Peru. It's a tropical glacier called Calcaya. It's the largest tropical glacier in the world. It's high in the Andes Mountains. And he had been studying it for the past several years, focused on this glacier from Chicago. And you're seeing here two satellite images. And what I learned from Andrew is that a lot of their science was actually done through satellite imagery. So it wasn't a very hands-on process. It was almost as remote as you can get with images taken from high in the sky. But as we were talking, I sort of started to find ways in which our processes mirrored each other. So he was looking at 30-something years of satellite imagery, which almost started to function like a stop motion animation record of how a glacier was shrinking through time. And he was also using radar imagery. And I, among other things, work with 3D animation. And based on this radar image, I could recreate the topography of this glacier. And then I could bring it into an animation program to merge it with the city of Chicago. And this sort of started to open up a world wherein we could look at Chicago and this place that neither of us had been to and start to imagine possibilities for how they could interact. And so you can see here in the dark blue, the perimeter of the glacier in 1985, and then the lighter blue is the perimeter of the glacier in 2015. So it's shrunk considerably. And Andrew calculated, it's a bit of speculative math here, but he calculated that if that amount of ice that has melted over the 30-year period were to fall as snow continuously on Chicago, it would reach an elevation of 600 feet. And so this became kind of the foundation for a short film called Scaling Kelkaya. And we'll just watch 1 minute of it right now, if that's all right, Zach. So that's just 1 minute of a longer video, which we will link to as well. So that sort of was the result of this ongoing conversation, which ended up being about a 3-year conversation of just going back and forth between his process and my process and sort of building this new reality together. And then this past year, actually, I've been involved in a project called Third Coast Disrupted, which was a group of 7 artists and 7 scientists, all based in Chicago, working together in a larger communal conversation about how climate change is going to impact Chicago in particular. So before I was looking at a distant but very meaningful event, and this became much more of a conversation about what's happening here. And so one of the biggest takeaways that I gained was that as it gets warmer here in Chicago, it's going to lead to there being much more water in the air, which will lead to more extreme precipitation events, which means big rainstorms, which means flooding. And so some of the other artists in what became an exhibition last fall took this in different directions, but I focused on the flooding. So this is a painting of a 2013 flood in Des Plaines. And you can see this McDonald's unfortunately met its demise in this flood. But Chicago's a very low-lying area, and the flooding will really dramatically impact infrastructure and will affect the south sides of Chicago more profoundly. And so I created a series of paintings and video that kind of explored not only what's happening now, but what could happen and also how it's portrayed. So this is a painting of another artist in the exhibition's basement, which flooded in Chicago, and she actually relocated to Georgia ultimately. I also started painting the news about climate change, but somewhat altered. So this is a depiction of the Chicago Tribune. And this was also somewhat influenced by COVID and not being able to go and explore some of the places that I wish to, and instead taking everything in through the screen as we all are. And I have one little closing video just as a little teaser to end this. So that was an actual sewer geyser that erupted on the north side of Chicago after the inability to contain floodwaters led to to a rather unpleasant event. So.
Wow, thank you so much. Quick question from our friends out in the audience. Emily wants to know what was the name of the short film again, because I think she wants to check it out later.
Sure, it's Scaling Kelkaya. That's Quelccaya.
I'm glad you got that one, because I wouldn't have been able to help with that one. Meredith, I have a question. So you work in multiple forms of visual media. How do you make a decision about what you're going to do or what media you're going to use for a specific project or an idea that you have?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure I always know myself. I think the first project that I showed was very tech heavy, and I think that was partially what I was exploring at the time, but it was also a function of Andrew's work, and he was working with satellites and a lot of data and computers, and it was almost this chameleon-like way of meeting him in the middle, where I was like, oh, some of your language is my language. I don't normally use it in this way, but I know what it means to like look at a bunch of images over time. And think about things in virtual space, like we can do that together. And then for the watercolors for this other show, I think the idea of water and rain kind of got into the project for me. And so I found myself wanting to work with it in this kind of watery material way as a reflection of the subject matter.
That makes quite a bit of sense, actually. Sorry, suddenly all these questions like immediately come in, so I've got to ask you a question so I can read the questions. So I mean, I think that's super interesting. I was thinking back to your introduction, and you were talking about how did you get into this space and this kind of work, and you mentioned correct me if I'm wrong with this, but it sounded like you feel that it just kind of seeped into your subconscious being kind of over an extended period of time because of these walks with your parents. Was there, though, beyond that, like a specific moment or a specific interaction where suddenly you thought, hey, this is something that I think I could really explore, that it really kind of crystallized?
You know, I came across a paper that I wrote in the 7th grade, and it was like, what are you concerned about? And I was like, I'm concerned about climate change. So I think in some ways it's been present with me for a long time. But I think the first project that I showed was the one where I really felt like it was something that I could work on within the art world. There's so many different conversations within the art world and in many art worlds, really. But trying to find a sort of scientific entry point, I think that was when I felt like, okay, I can merge these interests, and that was thanks in part to a sort of institutional structure. But that was where I really felt like I could put a stake in the ground and say, okay, I think I can make this part of my artistic work and engage with it more meaningfully.
Yeah, and did the people who were around you, were they supportive of that? Because I feel like it, especially in academia, like, and now interdisciplinary work is kind of encouraged. So did you find that, or did you meet with some resistance?
I think at times it can feel a little bit like, is this art or is this education? And I think it's art. I think it's art that's being inspired by diverse sources. But I think sometimes artists can feel threatened by science. There's this sense of that's authority. And if I, you know, if I'm too close to that, then I'm going to lose the ability to be expressive, or I'm going to lose the kind of room around telling a story. It's going to have to be true and accurate. So I did feel a little bit of resistance around that. But I think over time that conversation is shifting.
Excellent. We have one specific question from anonymous attendee. Anonymous would like to know, how does the perspective of this phenomena, such as the flooding, change when viewed in the physical eye, or through a camera lens, or through your own artwork? And then as a follow-up, is it just same view as when you first see through your eye?
So for instance, the painting of the flooded McDonald's, I didn't actually see it in person, which I suspect would be yet again quite another experience. Um, I think one of the strange things about climate change, and in a way also a strange thing about COVID, is it's such a huge event that everyone's going to have their own personal engagement with it. And you can sort of talk about it in the aggregate, or you can talk about your very immediate personal experience. And I would say my most personal experience is probably there is a pond near me, and I've just seen it freeze less and less over time. So I mean, that's a very like mild, almost like nostalgic way of talking about climate change, whereas someone who, for instance, experienced Katrina or one of the myriad hurricanes that's battered the southern United States are going to have yet another experience. So yeah, I don't know if that directly responds to that, but I don't want to assume that I've had an experience that I haven't.
Yeah. And one more question directed at you, and then I have a few questions for the whole panel as we start to wrap up. And it's my question, but it's combined with a comment from David, who says, it seems to me that your paintings and video would be very powerful to help people understand critical ocean level increases in places like Washington, D.C. And I bring this up because I think for me, one of my next questions, I feel like I've answered the question, is music a tool for environmental change, or, and change? But then it's a question of, well, how efficient is it? What is the efficacy of doing so? What is the outcome that you wish to see? And I'm curious, what is the outcome you wish to see from your work? Like and what is some of the outcome that you've seen from your work, if you have any information about that?
Yeah, when Kirsten was talking earlier about feeling like there's this sort of tension of everything else happening in your life and then really wanting to work on, sort of staying close to these issues, that resonated for me. I mean, in one sense, I wish with my life that I could just purely go and try to affect policy change. But that's not who I am by any stretch of the imagination. And so I'm channeling what energy I do have towards sort of staying with this topic. It's kind of like, I'm just gonna be myself and try to stay with this, almost kind of like an exercise in attention, just to be that one person who's like, hey, the climate is changing, it's a problem. And so I'm not sure if I'm making sweeping change by any means, but it's one little flag that's waving, and hopefully encouraging, and maybe causing a breeze. But I that sort of tension of like, am I making a difference versus am I just doing what I can uh, with the tools that I have.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to remind myself, even too, I read in the book Song to the Sailor's Sea, we never ask when people write research papers or white papers to then show the efficacy of their research on affecting change in the world. So it's interesting, why would we ask that of art too? So
I think it does. I mean, I don't want to be too nihilistic. It's the dance where it's like, I don't want to take credit that I don't think I've earned, but I also think that the arts are incredibly powerful, incredibly meaningful. They give us the imagery and the words we use, the movements, the sounds we use to communicate with each other. So.
Right. And we even see in prehistoric times, right? Like, why did our ancient ancestors paint their hands all up along walls and caves when they were busy trying to save themselves from woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers? There was clearly an importance to visual art, to expression in some kind, because it's not like the hand necessarily tells you what berry not to eat, right? That was completely different idea probably in there. Wonderful. So a question for everybody, and anybody can chime in here. There were a couple given out in the overall chat. I think, Kirsten, you might have actually answered Ron's to him specifically, but there was a question about climate change versus climate urgency, and the idea of can and how could the arts be used to maybe change the narrative, so that way it's not just, oh, there's climate change and we should do something about it, to no, there's a big freaking deal here. What do we do? And use art to advance that. And then I'm curious what all of you think about that topic and how that might be addressed.
Well, I did share something with Ron in the chat feature, but something that has occurred to me and that I've wrestled with in my research and writing is the many ways that musicians, composers, performers have been addressing this topic. And so you do have, for instance, in the music of John Luther Adams, who worked for many years as a full-time environmental activist, headed an agency, and then turned to composing. And he very much, his style is to move people through these sonic landscapes and to encourage this deep ecological listening. I just love that phrase. I'll use it forever. And so his works are not necessarily overtly political. And I wouldn't even necessarily say they have an urgency to them. There's a slowness to his method. On the other hand, you have other choral works, for instance, Stacey Garrop's Terra Nostra, which has some really frightening text in it. And so I think, there's a lot of ways to go about this business. And something we learn as performers is know your audience also. And there's a strategic calculation, I think, that takes place both from the educational behind the scenes standpoint, the programming standpoint, and what you share with the world. And I think risks can be taken, but you also need to make all those little calculations along the way.
Fantastic. Sandra, Meredith, any thoughts on that one? I have one more question after this one before we wrap up. Nope, looks like they are not going to answer though, and that's totally fine. I actually want to combine two questions that are left in our chat, and it's great because then we'll have checked off everything that's going on. So one person had asked, what is your relationship as an artist with activist groups who advocate for political change? And the second question revolves around how do you provide advice on how to become more deeply involved in this field? And I think both are along the same lines. Like, how do you get more involved? How do you start doing what you're doing? And I would also throw in, we don't all have like academic positions. So there are things outside the university with whether it deals with activist groups, whether it deals with our own individual artistry and working with other groups. What can we do in academia and what can we do outside academia to get more involved?
I'll respond to that. I mean, yeah, there is no roadmap. You're like the Knights of the Round Table. You go off into the forest where there is no path and not only will there not be any path, but even some of you young scientists and artists are going to have opposition, people telling you climate change is not real, or even, undercutting your efforts because it's more economically or politically convenient. And, so there's that journey, that personal journey. And unfortunately, I really don't have a lot to tell you. It is just to convince you that it's really important. And that's how it happens, is you kind of go at it alone and then you find people. I mean, nowadays with social media, actually, you can find like-minded people. I do feel that, I'll give the example of, we had two students who were double majors in dance and sociology. They formed a dance company called Loud Bodies, which is a social justice dance company. They're creating work. They're doing, in addition to their artistic creations, they're doing community involvement. And they started that organization themselves. And they actually found that the background, so they're the creators of that. Those of us in academia enjoy an extremely privileged position, and it just goes without saying. So yeah, that would be my comment there.
Yeah, I really like what Sandra says about building your own roadmap. I mean, I think the climate change, the climate crisis is a vast challenge, which in a way means that there's vast opportunity to respond to it as well. There's so many groups that are working. I know Extinction Rebellion works in Chicago. There's 350.org. There's so many local groups that are constantly thinking and talking about this. So you can write to people. Like, for instance, the scientists that I worked with, I went on like blind dates with scientists essentially until I found somebody who would collaborate with me. So reach out, and I think people are interested. They're just looking for a way forward. So if you have a creative idea, someone may well want to hear it.
Kirsten, any thoughts from you?
Lots of thoughts, but you know, I just want to echo both what Meredith and Sandra said about carving your own path, and it really is about reaching out. Um, you know, John Luther Adams has been so important to my research, and of course, he's won a Pulitzer Prize and many other awards for his work. And I just wrote him a little email one day saying, "Dear Mr. Adams, would you meet with me and talk about your work?" Consequently, I have several new scores from him that nobody else has seen yet. And it's exciting because I think people are, and I think there's an exponential building that can happen from what is a very, very young sort of emerging discipline or interdisciplinary area. So I think just, you know, finding like-minded people and then just take a risk and step forward into something that you may not know if it will work or not. So it's a matter of doing and reaching out. And I think that will always lead in the most positive direction. And you'll be surprised at what you find and who you find in the process.
Yeah. And this is a great segue, because as we come to a close, there was one last question, and that was, how do I, not me, but this person, get involved in the program at Loyola, the music, the art, and climate? And you're looking at 4 people, not including myself, but the other people on the screen: Kirsten, Sandra, Meredith, and Dean Tuckman, who are doing this kind of work at Loyola in the arts and environmental sustainability. And those would be the people you contact at Loyola if you're interested in getting involved in some way. And if you can't join one of their organizations or their groups, I bet that they might be able to point you to somebody else too. So with that, I know we're coming to a close. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. It was so much fun to get to to hear your excitement and enthusiasm, and to see all of your and hear all of your great works, and what you're doing at Loyola and in Chicago and in the world. It was such a pleasure to get to do that with everybody tonight and to explore that. So thank you so much. And thank you again, Dean Tuckman, for letting me and all of us come together for the climate for the climate conference this year. Hopefully we'll come back another year and get to do it again.
You're always welcome, Thomas. Thank you for doing such a great job moderating. And thank you to Kirsten, Sandra, and Meredith for sharing your work with us. You know, it's so true that art is a universal language. And as a scientist, I couldn't teach photosynthetic processes better than Sandra with a bunch of kids doing a dance. You know, I do think it's very important for us to continue collaborating. This has been a really rich collaboration over the years, and I'm excited that you were all featured tonight on this panel. I would just love to say a couple of words thanking everybody who participated tonight, all the participants that stayed with us for the full hour and a half. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank our donors. We have a whole list of donors that Zach is going to put up on the screen here, and I'd just like to give a particular thank you to the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund, who are the premier investor sponsors of the entire conference. And then with tonight's panel, I would also like to thank Loyola University's Office of Mission and Integration for their big donation towards this particular panel. Everybody else that's listed there, thank you so much for your sponsorship and your continued support of the School of Environmental Sustainability and this conference. We hope to see you back here again tomorrow night, same time, 6 o'clock, for the Indigenous Youth panel. We have 4 Indigenous youth that will be talking to us about how they do climate action through, through their own spirituality, through their own art, and through their own practices. I think it's going to be a really rich conversation tomorrow. If you haven't yet registered and you are interested in registering for tomorrow night, please go to the website that you see listed there, luc.edu/climate change, and register yourself at no charge. Thank you again for joining us, and everybody have a pleasant evening and good night. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.